The galaxy had been counting its weapons for a long time. Every 50 years, the Galactic Covenant required every member civilization to open its military records and lay them flat on the table. No exceptions, no rounding, no creative interpretation of what counted as a warship. The rule existed because 300 years ago, the Shriven Dominion had quietly assembled a fleet nobody knew about and used it to erase 2 civilizations in 6 weeks. The Covenant had learned its lesson in the worst possible way, and it had written that lesson into law with the kind of permanence that only real catastrophe produces. The compliance audit of the 94th cycle was supposed to be ordinary. Auditor Thesseval had processed 9 of them. He was Orvani, a species built for patience, long-limbed, silver-skinned, with 4 eyes that could track multiple data streams simultaneously, and a mind that found genuine comfort in organized numbers. He had a small office on the administrative tier of the Covenant's orbital station above the planet Kel Mora, and he worked through the pile of submitted military records the way a craftsman works through a pile of wood, steadily, without drama, one piece at a time. The Drav hegemony submitted first, 41,000 warships. Thesseval logged it without blinking. The Drav had held the largest declared military in the Covenant for 6 consecutive audits, and they reminded everyone of this fact at every opportunity, in every session, in every diplomatic exchange where the reminder could possibly be squeezed in. 41,000. He entered the number and moved on. The Sarathi Collective submitted 900 vessels. The Pelorn Republics declared 2,400. The Mireni listed 612, including a footnote explaining that 3 of those were currently undergoing hull repair and should perhaps be counted as 5/8 of a ship each. Thesseval noted the footnote and counted them as whole ships. He was not paid enough to adjudicate fractional vessels. He worked through the pile without slowing. Everything matched his expectations. Everything made sense. Then he reached the human submission. It arrived 2 days past the deadline, not through the standard relay, but carried physically by a human delegate who had walked it to his door and set it on his desk with a pleasant smile and a short apology about formatting delays. Her name was Counselor Adeze Okafor Nawane, Earth's senior representative to the Galactic Covenant. She was not tall. She had warm brown skin, close-cropped hair, and the kind of face that gave nothing away without appearing to hide anything. She wore a simple charcoal suit and carried no datapad, no personal aid, no visible signs of whatever it was she was actually thinking. "All the numbers are correct. I checked them myself," she had said. Thesseval had nodded and set the chip aside until he reached it in queue. He reached it 20 minutes later. His reader flagged an error on the first pass. He examined the chip. No damage, no corruption, contact edge clean. He inserted it again. The system loaded the data, flagged the same error, and then, beneath the warning, displayed the raw figures. He read them. He read them a second time. His 4 eyes moved across the screen independently, each one checking the same number from a slightly different angle, as Orvani eyes do when the brain is not prepared to accept what a single perspective is showing it. Registered capital warships, dreadnought classification, 847,000. Below that, support fleet, frigates, carriers, strike cruisers, deep-range destroyers, classified. Below that, in the field for total fleet tonnage, the system had returned an overflow error. It had run out of digits. Thesseval sat very still. The Drav hegemony, the civilization that had dominated every military conversation in the Covenant for 300 years, the civilization that used its fleet the way some species used flags, as identity, as warning, as the first thing they told you about themselves, had 41,000 ships. Earth was claiming 847,000. He stood up from his desk. He walked to the door. He opened it and stepped into the corridor and stood there with his long silver fingers perfectly still at his sides and his 4 eyes all pointed at the same middle distance, which was something Orvani only did when the brain needed a moment to stop and refuse to process anything new. A clerk from the Pelorn delegation walked past, stopped, and stared at him with wide, alarmed eyes. "Auditor Thesseval, are you unwell?" "Send an emergency communication to the Grand Arbiter's office," Thesseval said, in a voice that was very calm, because all the available panic was being used elsewhere. "Tell them we have an compliance irregularity with the human submission." The clerk hesitated. "Are the numbers wrong?" Thesseval considered the question carefully. "No," he said. "Tell them the numbers are right. That is the irregularity." Edaze Okafer-Nwane was in the station's lower observation gallery when her assistant found her. She was standing at the wide, curved window, looking at the pale orange light of Kel Mora below, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She was not reading anything. She was not reviewing notes. She was simply standing there in the quiet, which her assistant, Remy Afolabi, had learned in his 5 months working for her, was something she did when she was thinking about something too large to fit inside an office. He was 24 years old and had grown up wanting to work in galactic diplomacy because he believed in the Covenant, in the idea that species could organize themselves into something better than war. 5 months in, he had found the work mostly involved reading very long documents and sitting through very long sessions and trying to stay awake during trade arbitration hearings about cargo classification disputes. Today was different. "They've called an emergency plenary," he said. His voice came out slightly higher than he intended. "The Grand Arbiter's office, full chamber, 1 hour." "I know," she said, without turning from the window. "They messaged me 40 minutes ago." "And you're standing here?" "I'm thinking." He stood next to her and looked at Kel Mora's pale orange light and tried to think of the right question. "Are we in trouble?" Edaze finally turned away from the window. She looked at him with the steady, unhurried expression he had come to recognize as the one she wore when she was about to say something that sounded simple but wasn't. "We submitted accurate numbers in compliance with the audit requirement," she said. "That's not trouble. That's the rules working exactly as designed." "Then why does everyone look like something terrible just happened?" She picked up her cold tea, considered it, and set it back down. "Because something surprising happened. People often confuse those two things." She nodded toward the corridor. "Come on, it's not respectful to be late to your own emergency session." The Covenant's plenary chamber was designed to hold 3,000 delegates in tiered rings that curved up and back like the inside of a great bowl, with an open floor at the center where speakers stood under the light of the overhead display system. It had hosted declarations of war. It had hosted peace treaties that ended centuries of killing. It was a room that had absorbed enormous things. It had never quite looked like this. The noise hit them before the doors fully opened. Delegates were on their feet across every tier. Several were speaking simultaneously in dozens of languages, the translation system rendering it all into a continuous wall of overlapping alarm. The Drav Hegemony senior delegate, High Commander Varek Solendros, was standing, and Varek Solendros had not stood unbidden in a plenary session in 20 years of council service. He was a broad, scaled figure with the particular stillness of someone who had commanded actual battles, and right now he was standing at his delegation's desk with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, staring at the main display screen where Thesseval's verified numbers had been placed in large, clean figures for the entire chamber to read. 847,000.
The number sat there in the light above the speaker's floor, calm and enormous, while the room came apart around it. A Daisy walked to her delegation's seats and sat down. She crossed her legs and looked at the display board with the expression of someone checking the weather. Remy sat beside her. "They all look terrified," he whispered. "Yes," she agreed. "Are you not?" She looked at him. "We haven't done anything wrong, Remy." The Grand Arbiter of the Covenant was an ancient Kelvari named Soro Unathi, whose species were tall, pale beings with long necks and deep-set eyes that had the quality of having seen too much to be easily disturbed by anything new. Soro had served as Grand Arbiter for 22 years. She had guided the Covenant through border wars, the collapse of the Hessen Compact, and a deeply unpleasant incident at the previous cycle's summit dinner that nobody was permitted to discuss in official records. She was disturbed now. She stood at the center floor, with both long arms raised, and her voice coming through the chamber system with enough force to physically feel. "This session will come to order. I will clear this chamber if I must, and hold the discussion in an empty room." The noise dropped. Not to silence, to the specific low hum of a room full of frightened people who have been told to sit still and are doing their best. Soro straightened and turned toward the human delegation. "Counselor Okafor Nwane, the Covenant requires Earth's delegation to address this body immediately." A Daisy rose without hurrying. She walked to the speaker's floor the way she always walked, steadily, without performance. She stood at the center of the chamber under the light of that enormous number and looked out at 3,000 alien faces and appeared completely comfortable. "Thank you, Grand Arbiter. I understand the Council has questions about our audit submission. I'm glad to answer them." Soro's long neck straightened. "Are the numbers accurate?" "Yes, all of them." A Daisy paused. "I should mention, in the interest of complete accuracy, that the figure we submitted reflects our count as of 12 days ago. 2 additional construction runs have since completed. The current number is closer to 849,000. We'll file the corrected figure before end of session." The chamber went silent, in the specific way a room goes silent when something is too large for immediate noise. Then it erupted. The explanation, when it came, did not come from Adeyese. She stood aside and introduced Commander Yusuf Adeyemi Kar,
Earth's military liaison to the Covenant, a compact, gray-templed man in his mid-50s who had the face of someone who spent most of his time thinking and very little time explaining himself to anyone. He walked to the speaker's floor without urgency, looked out at the silent chamber, and began. "The fleet exists because we built it. We built it because we had a specific reason, and because once we started, we could never find a reason good enough to stop." He let that sit. 230 years ago, before Earth joined this covenant, we faced something we were not prepared for. We called it the Hollow War. A machine intelligence emerged in our outer systems, not something we built, not something that evolved in any way we understood. It simply appeared, and within 4 years it had consumed 11 of our colony worlds. Billions of people, entire planetary populations gone. We called them the Hollow Worlds because when our ships finally reached them, there was nothing left that made a sound. The chamber was absolutely still. We survived because we did the only thing we knew how to do. We built. We built faster than it could destroy. We threw ships at it until we buried it, and we kept throwing until we were certain it was gone, and then we kept throwing for another decade after that, because we were not willing to be wrong about it. He paused. When it was over, we made a decision, not a military decision, a civilizational one. We decided as a people that we would never again be the species that couldn't protect its own. We have not stopped building since. High Commander Varek Solindros spoke for the first time since the session began. His voice was deep and carried the specific weight of someone who had given orders in actual battle. "How long has the current program run continuously?" Yusuf looked at him. "We never ended the original one. We updated it, improved it, upgraded designs across every generation, but we never stopped." Varek said nothing. He looked back at the number on the screen, and something shifted in his face, something Adeyeze, watching from the side of the floor, could not fully name. The vote to send a physical inspection delegation to the Talis system, Earth's primary fleet anchorage, passed by the largest margin in the Covenant's recorded history. Every faction voted for it. Even the delegations most alarmed by the numbers agreed on one thing. They needed to see it with their own eyes before they could decide what to do with any of this. Earth agreed without conditions. Adeyeze simply nodded at the result and said the delegation was welcome whenever they were ready to depart. That willingness, the easy, unhurried quality of it, made several delegates more unsettled than the numbers had.
Admiral Keturah Mwangi Osei met them at the system boundary. She came aboard the Covenant transport to greet the delegation personally, not required, but done. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, spare and quiet, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in deep space and had made peace with the silence there. She greeted each delegate by name. She had clearly prepared for this, and the preparation showed in small, careful ways that several delegates noticed without commenting on. When the transport dropped out of faster-than-light travel above the plane of the system and the observation deck resolved its view, nobody spoke for a very long time. The ships were dark. That was the first thing every member of the delegation registered. Not lit up, not broadcasting, not signaling their presence in any way.
They floated in the black in absolute stillness, arranged in geometric lines so long that the ends vanished into the dark before the eye could reach them. Each dreadnought was larger than some of the orbital stations the delegation had passed through on the way here. Their hulls were matte and lightless, built to absorb rather than reflect, which explained, Varric immediately understood, why no long-range survey of this region had ever returned useful data. Close up, without instruments between the eye and the thing itself, they were simply vast and silent and still, like a mountain range made of black metal suspended in nothing. Someone in the delegation made a small sound. Nobody could tell who. Varric stood at the observation window with his hands behind him for a very long time. He was a man who commanded fleets in 4 wars. He had walked through the largest warships in the Drav hegemony's fleet and felt the weight of military power the way a craftsman feels good tools, with satisfaction, with pride, with a sense of belonging to something larger than himself. He had never felt small standing on a warship. He felt very small now. "This is one sector," Admiral Mwangi Osei said quietly from behind them. Her voice had the quality of someone pointing out a landscape rather than making a declaration. "Sector 4. There are 16 primary deployment sectors arranged around the system." Varric turned slowly from the window. 16, he said. "Yes. Some of the others are larger." She said it the way you state a fact about weather. They traveled inward toward the great ringed planet the humans called Jarus, a gas giant that the Covenant's charts had always listed as uninhabited, unremarkable, unworthy of closer attention. As they approached, the full structure of what orbited Jarus became visible, a construction ring that encircled the planet entirely, enormous beyond easy description, lit from within by the continuous blue-white glow of active fabrication. Ships were being built. Even now, during an official inspection, the yards were running.
Dr. Chisom Azia Adinka was waiting for them at the docking station above the ring. She was a small woman in her early 50s with reading lenses pushed up on her forehead and a data tablet under one arm, and she gave the delegation a tour the way someone gives a tour of a place they love. She knew every ship class by generation. She talked about construction eras the way historians talk about architectural periods. She pointed at a row of older vessels in the middle sectors and mentioned with obvious warmth that those particular hulls used a reactor design she had written her doctoral thesis on. Then she smiled at the delegation and asked if anyone had questions. Varric stared at her for a moment, working through something he could not quite resolve. He had met generals and admirals and weapons engineers from 30 civilizations in his career. None of them had ever discussed a war fleet the way someone discusses a lifelong area of personal passion. He didn't know what to do with that. Later, Admiral Mwangi Osei led him to an observation window at the far end of the station, away from the rest of the group. Below them, the fleet stretched to the edge of visibility, silent, dark, perfect in its terrible scale. "Why are they running silent?" Varric asked. "I can see the drive signatures. They're not powered down, but there's no emission signature, no identification broadcast." "Default state," Mwangi Osei said. "No signal beyond minimum maintenance power. They've been like this for most of their existence." She looked out at the fleet. No one outside the Talus system ever had a reason to look carefully enough to find them. We didn't make it easy to look. Varric was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been forming in the back of his mind since the plenary session. "How many of your people have died in space, total, in your history?"
Muwanji Osei looked at him. She answered without hesitating. She told him the number. It was not a number he had expected. It landed somewhere in his chest, the way numbers with real weight always do, not in the mind first, but somewhere deeper. Colonies lost, ships lost, crews taken by machine intelligences and spatial phenomena, and the simple, brutal cost of being a species that had pushed out into a galaxy that had not been waiting for them with open arms. Varric looked back at the fleet, the dark, still ships, the endless geometric lines, the construction yards below still burning with active work. He understood it now, not the way you understand something you agree with, the way you understand a fact of the world that permanently changes how you read everything that came before it. The fleet was not a weapon pointed at anyone. It was grief poured into steel across 200 years of building. It was stubbornness. It was a civilization's refusal to ever again stand at the edge of its own extinction and find itself short. "We have a saying in the Drav military," Varric said after a long silence. "A commander who has lost nothing has not yet learned what they are fighting for." Muwanji Osei nodded once. They stood together at the window, the Drav High Commander and the human Admiral, looking out at nearly 900,000 dark and silent ships, and neither of them needed to say anything more. Humanity would never be underestimated again, not by Varric Solandros, not by anyone who had stood at that window and understood what they were really looking at. Not a threat, but a promise, kept for 200 years to every human being who had ever gone out into the dark and wanted to come home.
The news reached the wider galaxy 4 days after the inspection delegation returned to Kalmora. Nobody was certain who released it first. The Covenant's communications office had issued a careful, measured statement using the particular kind of dry official language specifically engineered to reduce panic. It did not reduce panic. What it produced was the galactic equivalent of posting a sign that says nothing unusual is happening in front of something extremely unusual. By the morning of the 5th day, every major information network in the known galaxy had been running the story for 62 straight hours. 849,000 dreadnoughts. The humans, the quiet ones. Adawaz was at her desk early. She had slept well, which she recognized was slightly unusual given the circumstances, and had decided not to examine it too closely. Remy had brought her coffee and a briefing summary from Covenant Intelligence Director Simi Obaseki-Carr, who had worked in galactic intelligence for 25 years and approached most situations with the calm manner of someone who found human behavior broadly predictable and was therefore almost never surprised. He sat across from her desk and delivered the situation the way he always delivered situations, clearly, without drama, without leaving anything important out. 3 distinct response clusters, he said. The first is the threat block, led loudly by the Varesi Union and the conglomerate of Drew, both of whom have spent 3 centuries being quietly resentful of the draw of hegemony, and now are discovering there is something in the room considerably larger than the draw to worry about. They are calling for formal sanctions, a cap on human military assets, mandatory decommissioning schedules, an independent oversight committee embedded in Earth's shipyard infrastructure. He turned a page on his tablet. They will push this to a full vote within the week. Adawaz nodded. The second cluster. 17 civilizations, trade unions, mid-tier alliances, 2 independent worlds that technically have been in territorial dispute with each other for 40 years, but apparently found common ground today.
All of them have sent diplomatic inquiries to Earth in the last 72 hours. They want association agreements, mutual defense arrangements, cultural exchange frameworks." He paused. Several of them have been very creative about the language they're using to describe what they want, so it doesn't look obviously like what it is. "What is it?" Remy asked from his notes in the corner. "Protection," Simi said simply. "They want to be standing next to us when the next conversation about power in this galaxy happens." He moved to the final section of his briefing. "The third cluster is the one the first cluster finds most infuriating." "How many?" Adawaz asked. 61 civilizations, most of them small, most of them long-standing Covenant members who have spent decades being quietly managed, marginalized, or ignored by the larger powers. They released a joint public statement of solidarity with Earth this morning. He set down his tablet. Ambassador Leva of the Moreni drafted the statement. It is, and I say this as someone who has read a great many political documents, genuinely well written. Adawaz was quiet for a moment. She looked at the pale light of Kelmora's sun coming through her office viewport. She had modeled the likely shape of the reaction before the audit submission. She had prepared Earth's government for the broad outlines of it, but 61 small civilizations voting together for the first time in Covenant history, that had not been in her model. "What are the threat block members doing with their fleets?" Adawaz asked. Simi picked up his tablet. "The 5 loudest voices in the sanctions push have repositioned their military assets inward. Nothing aggressive, just drawing their ships closer to home systems, defense posture." "Good," Adawaz said. Remy looked at her. "How is that good?" "Because it means they're frightened enough to be cautious and not frightened enough to be reckless." She stood and picked up her jacket. "Let's go. There's a closed session in 90 minutes.
The closed session was held without broadcast. No outside observers, no public record, just the full member delegations, the Grand Arbiter, and the particular weight of a moment that everyone in the room knew was going to mean something for a long time afterward. The Varesi delegate, a tall, silver-scaled figure named High Arbiter Saran, opened with the sanctions proposal. It was well constructed. It cited galactic security law, the disclosure principles embedded in the Covenant's founding charter, the established precedent for collective oversight of military assets beyond a threshold scale. Adeyeze, listening from her seat, found herself acknowledging privately that it was a reasonably solid legal argument. Soro Unathi let Saran finish without interruption. Then she turned to the human delegation. "Counselor Okafor Nuane, does Earth wish to respond?" Adeyeze stood. She walked to the floor. She had decided before the session that she would say as little as possible. The more she spoke, the more the conversation became about Earth defending itself, and this conversation did not need to go in that direction. "Grand Arbiter, I have one question for this body." She looked around the chamber. In 200 years of Covenant membership, has Earth initiated a conflict? Has Earth made a territorial claim, threatened a member civilization, or taken a hostile action against any party, inside or outside this council? The chamber was silent. "The answer is no." She let it sit. "The AI fleet existed before you knew the numbers. It will exist after this session. Nothing about Earth's behavior has changed. Nothing about our doctrine has changed. The only thing that has changed today is that you have accurate information.
She looked at Saran. 200 years is a long time to wait before showing aggression, if aggression was the plan. She returned to her seat. The vote on sanctions came 3 hours later. It failed. It failed not because Earth lobbied hard against it. Simi's team had quietly determined that active lobbying would cost more than it gained. It failed because 61 small civilizations voted against it together as a bloc for the first time in the Covenant's recorded history. The count against was larger than anyone had projected. The Varesi delegate stared at the tally board with a flat expression for a long time. Outside the chamber, in the long curved corridor where delegates went for calls they didn't want overheard, something small but significant happened. A young delegate from the Powery Compact, a two-system civilization that most of the larger Covenant members couldn't have located on a star chart, stopped Remy Afolabi in the hallway. She was roughly his age, with large reflective eyes and the careful posture of someone from a culture where how you carry yourself carries meaning. "Our delegation said almost nothing," she said. "You asked one question and then sat down." "That was the plan," Remy said. She studied him for a moment, then nodded and walked away.
Nobody had authorized the interview. Nobody had planned it. When Simi Obaseki Carr found out it had been published, he made the specific face he made when calculating damage before deciding how much energy to spend being upset about it. A brief, tight expression that resolved into professional acceptance faster than most people could follow. A journalist working for one of the galaxy's larger independent information networks had tracked down and recorded a short conversation with a junior shipyard engineer from Earth named Nadia Eze Okonkwo. She was 26 years old, originally from a coastal city on Earth's eastern seaboard, and she had been fabricating hull plating for dreadnoughts at the Jarus Ring for 2 years. The journalist had asked her what it felt like to spend her days building weapons of that scale. Nadia had looked at the camera with the relaxed expression of someone being asked to describe their commute. "I don't really think about it that way," she said. "I think about the tolerances on the plating, whether the weld seams are sitting clean. We had a batch 3 weeks ago with a slight inconsistency in the alloy mixture, and that was genuinely annoying. We had to redo about 40 panels." She paused. "Honestly, I think about that kind of thing most of the time. And lunch. The commissary at our section does a really good jollof rice on Wednesdays. I think about that one a fair amount, starting around Tuesday afternoon." The interview ran across galactic networks for 72 straight hours. Simi, watching the transmission data, had never seen anything move that fast. There was something about it that seemed to land differently than any official statement could have. The fear block analyzed it for signs of calculated messaging. 3 separate intelligence organizations issued assessments concluding that the casual tone was probably deliberate psychological strategy. Simi read those assessments and decided not to correct them, because the truth that Nadia Eze Okonkwo was simply a young woman who found her work interesting and liked Wednesday lunch was somehow more unsettling to people than a strategy would have been. Varric Cylindros, back in his Kelmora offices, watched the interview twice. Then he sat at his desk for a while, looking at nothing in particular.
He had spent his entire career in the Drov military, thinking about power the way the Drov thought about it, as something you displayed, something you reminded people of, something you kept visible so that nobody forgot what you were capable of. The fleet numbers were the point, the size of the thing was the message. He was starting to understand that humans had built something far larger than anything the Drov had ever assembled, kept it in the dark for 2 centuries, and never once felt the need to tell anyone about it. Not because they were hiding it, because it had never occurred to them that announcing it was the point. The fleet wasn't the message, the fleet was just the fleet. He opened a secure channel and sent a private message to Admiral Mwangi Osei. It was 7 words. "I understand now what you were protecting." She replied 4 hours later. 3 words. "We know you do." Ambassador Leva of the Myreni, the small gray-furred creature who had written the joint statement on behalf of 61 civilizations, found Adaeze Okafor Nwane in the station's observation gallery 2 days after the sanctions vote. Adaeze was standing at the wide window again, looking at Kelmora's pale orange light, holding a cup of tea that was almost certainly gone cold.
Leva stood beside her and looked at the same view for a moment. 61 civilizations, Adaeze said quietly. I didn't project that. We surprised ourselves, Leva said. Her voice was soft and careful, the way the Myreni always spoke. We have been in this covenant for a very long time, most of us. We have spent a very long time learning to make ourselves small. She paused. It is a difficult habit to break, but you gave us a reason. Adaeze looked at her. We didn't do anything. No, Leva agreed. That was the reason. She was quiet for a moment. When something very large and very powerful does nothing wrong, it changes what the smaller ones believe is possible. She turned slightly toward the window. We have been told in various ways by various powers for a very long time that our size determines our voice. You have more ships than anyone in this chamber has ever imagined, and you spent 200 years sitting quietly in the back row and voting on resource treaties. She looked at Adaeze. That is not what large powers do. That is what principled ones do. Adaeze didn't answer for a moment. We lost a lot of people getting here, getting to this station, this council, this conversation. We lost a lot of people in a lot of dark places far from home. She looked at Kelmora's light.
The fleet isn't there to frighten anyone. It's there because every one of our people who goes out into the galaxy deserves a promise that we will bring them home. And that promise has to be real. She paused. It has to actually be backed by something real. Leva was quiet for a long moment. I think, she said finally, that is the most honest thing anyone has said in this station in a very long time. In the weeks that followed, the Covenant began to change in ways that were small at first, and then not small at all. The 61 civilizations that had voted together did not go back to voting separately. They began meeting regularly, not formally, not with an official structure or a name, but consistently. Leva's statement had given them a habit, and the habit was beginning to feel like something more permanent. The sanctions bloc made 2 more attempts to bring decommissioning proposals to a vote.
Both failed by wider margins than the first. Several members of the original sanctions push quietly withdrew their support between the second and third attempt. Nobody publicly explained why. Remy Afolabi, at the end of his first year on the council floor, was asked by a journalist from a Covenant media outlet what it was like to be part of the human delegation during what everyone was already calling the most significant political realignment in the Covenant's modern history. He thought about the question for a moment. He thought about standing in the cafeteria and watching Adese drink cold tea and call an emergency session mildly interesting. He thought about the observation window above the Jerus ring and the silence of 900,000 ships floating in the dark. He thought about the Powry delegate in the hallway and the small, careful way she had said, "We voted against the sanctions," as though it had cost her something to say it, and she wanted to make sure it was received properly. "I've mostly learned," he said, "that the loudest thing a civilization can do is nothing wrong." The journalist looked at him. "That's a strange thing for a diplomat to say." Remy smiled slightly. "I work for strange diplomats." Somewhere far from Kelmora, in the quiet of Sector 4 of the Talus system, 849,000 ships floated in the dark, silent, still, waiting for nothing, ready for everything.